So obviously quite a lot was covered in this series. It's over half the book. And let's talk, going through, as we have, each characters, what we've learned really about their past. The first character I'm going to go over is Lucia. Now, in a lot of ways, she's the character who we have some of the fewest revelations about. Most of what we had already learned about her um, was a lot of the base of it. But there are a few very important things that happen. For one thing, we see the death of her mother, Lena. We see kind of how they experienced that as a family with Lena, Lucia, Daniela. And also, most important, you see Lena's acceptance of Enrique's death. You see, particularly on page 234, if you want to turn your books to that page, you see that Lena has accepted that, that he died, and that as she herself dies, she feels his presence, she senses him, and there is that element of she says, "Oh, I know they killed him, Lucia. Enrique won't tell me how. He wants to convince me it was rapid." So you see that kind of acceptance of it, and it loosens Lena as she kind of chooses to starve to death as she's ill. You also see, Lena's death. You also see Lucia, on page 235. Lucia understood that death was not an end, was not the absence of life, but a power oceanic wave of clear, luminous water that was carrying her, by her leaving Lena, off to another dimension. Lena was loosening her ties to the earth. So we see that, is a very powerful impact on Lucia, her mother's death, and also her mother's final acceptance. We also see how Lucia experienced her own cancer, and the cancer led really directly to the end of her very failed marriage to Carlos. Yes, sweetheart, just a moment. Mama is working. Sorry, that is my teaching assistant, my son. So we see that we have the end of the marriage, we have her cancer, and we see also essentially how Lucia begins to kind of reawaken after all of those years that she had spent with Carlos, with essentially that kind of stifled love. We see her both reawakening, and we also see, interestingly enough, that Lucia has, grown up a bit in, this element. We see on page 295, really important, that Lucia has this experience, she has this relationship with Julian, that's kind of her kind of recovery. But we see on 295, by this time Lucia had learned to recognize failing love as soon as it raised its gargoyle head. She no longer put up with it as she had done through the 20 years of her marriage in the hope that something would change. She was more experienced and had less time to waste. She realized she ought to call it quits before Julian did, even though she would miss, and we see essentially that she's going to break up. And one of the things that's very important about this, and it's important for us to kind of see about Lucia, is that she has really overcome those sins and difficulties in her past. Even though most of her sins were simply, the Christmas tree effect that we'd seen before. And Lucia has learned from it, and so we have confidence as she moves forward into that relationship we know she's going into with Richard. We have a new confidence that Lucia understands when something is good or not good, and she's not going to make the same mistakes about love again. So that's a nice element about this character. We can see that, a lot of Lucia's kind of growing up happened in that past. So it kind of takes us to that present with Lucia. So that's really what we're going to, what was interesting about Lucia. A lot of her past also informs her decisions in the present, particularly with Catherine's body. And this, again, kept filling it out, that a lot of her decisions about Catherine, a lot of things she knows are in that long-standing search for what happened to her brother, and also that lack of knowledge of what her brother's body is, how he died, did he suffer. All of those things do inform the things she chooses to do with Catherine. Let's move on to Evelyn. And with Evelyn, we see a lot. Particularly, we see her journey to the U.S., the desert, the detention center. Really see that emphasis on, especially the detention center, the overcrowding, the rushing. We see very much the dangers that she went through, how close Evelyn went to death. And again, remember, this was, as we saw, that luxury route in. Obviously, luxury route in kind of almost air quotes. But the things she went through to get to the U.S., that very frightening experience she has, and it's very important in that detention center, this idea that here is she's encountering the legal system in a very real way for the first time, and we see its almost complete indifference to her. That kind of, oh, okay, she's treated as very much this cog in the machine. This, okay, here's what we do, here's what we go through. She's lost her documentation, and we just kind of push her on through because they're rushed or overcrowded. Now, this is part of what makes this book so very interesting and so very topical, obviously, in addition to being a very good book. We also have to remember that this book was written in different times to a degree, but still extremely relevant and very, very interesting. So we also see very much here Evelyn meets her mother. And, essentially, given the time between the last time she saw her mother, the vagueness of these memories, this is a true meeting between mother and daughter. And the mother can't be the one to get her because the mother herself is still illegal. So a lot of things Evelyn suddenly learns on her arrival. First of all, she learns that she has a stepfather. She learns that she has two half siblings, one 4, one 3. And that meeting with all of these is very shocking to her. This is, it shows that, here Miriam, she was having a connection to her children, her mother back in Guatemala. At the same time, she also built this new life for herself in the United States. That was an interesting decision not to tell her children that she'd remarried, not to tell her children that they had half siblings. It's an interesting idea. So we see that, and very much the what we want to really kind of think about, especially think about that meeting Evelyn has with Galileo Leone. He's saying that, hi, I'm your stepdad. All right, here we go. And she has to leave with a complete stranger. Even after everyone's verified, wait, is this actually real? So we're not about to kidnap her. And we also see this huge culture shock that Evelyn goes through just in this basic. We have to go to Walmart to get her some clothes. We're going to take her to McDonald's for some lunch. And she's just so overwhelmed with this idea of, look at all these clothes, look at all this wealth, look at all this food. She's looking at the McDonald's meal like, I can't even eat that. And there's also that incredible vulnerability that here she is, and she's having to be trusted with a stranger, Galileo Leone. She's told is her, mother's husband. They confirmed it over the phone, but she goes to a hotel room with someone who is a stranger. She really has that great vulnerability in that hotel scene with Galileo, where it's just like, okay, is something bad going to happen here? It does not. But we can also, in an interesting way, contrast that scene and Evelyn's vulnerability to the hotel room scenes that we've seen between Evelyn, Richard, and Lucia, where there is that sense of trust, of family, of Evelyn sleeps well because she feels that she is safe with these two individuals. They are taking care of her in the midst of this incredible experience and frightening experience that she's having. Contrast that with her experience with Galileo, where she was at that moment. So that, and then there's bringing home, and she, is basically having to be introduced to, hi, here's your mom, here are your half brothers, here's your living situation. And we see that, okay, here are the years that she lived, in this place with her mother's new husband, obviously her husband's, daughter from a previous marriage, who, as it turns out, is, what sparks the entire problem, because during that one fight with the daughter, and the police are called. And we see that even though this was a situation where probably pretty appropriate for police to be called, that's what it's again this encounter with the legal system, this physical embodiment of American law that actually puts Evelyn in danger again. That she's brought to their attention. She was a victim in this entire situation, and yet it puts her now in very real and relevant danger. This is a wonderful passage too. If you look on 226, that you have, here they are, an immigration representative has come, someone from the immigration service has come to the, house. We see this. He knew that Miriam and Galileo had residency in the United States, but Evelyn's Ortega, obviously Miriam's has come through her husband, who has legal residency through his situation as a Nicaraguan immigrant. But Evelyn Ortega's situation was not so clear. He had the detention center file with the date of her arrest at the border, and since she had no birth certificate, remember, she's lost it, he concluded she was 18 and therefore eligible for deportation. Silence while Miriam tried to calculate whether the man had come simply to uphold the law or was wishing for a bribe. Again, we see that this is the experience, that the legal system is something. And also we see her own experience, as someone who comes from a corrupt legal system, that can I bribe this? Is this what this situation is calling for? And it actually is Galileo who kind of steps forward and has that beautiful speech. This girl is a refugee. No one is illegal in this life. We all have the right to live in this world. Money and crime do not represent borders. I ask you, sir, why we human beings should do so. And the other, men is very taken aback, and they, clearly it is just a momentary gap. But the thing he says on leaving on 226, that's the really wonderful thing. And really important. It shows us that, real clash between the law, between justice. When he says, what the girl says about gangs and her murdered brothers is common. I've heard it many times. There are lots of similar stories from immigrants. The judges have heard them as well. Some of them believe them, others don't. Asylum or deportation will depend on which judge you get, was the man's parting shot. And here we see how very vulnerable Evelyn is in this moment, that she, if she follows what the law tells her to follow, which is present yourself to a judge, make your case, argue, that she is, put in a position where will this person believe her or not? And that phrase, many people tell these stories, we've all heard them. That's such an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because we saw that Evelyn experienced these things, and that these experiences were not uncommon in such a violent and problematic area. And yet this idea that people have become deadened to hearing about this kind of trauma, and that they will assume that she is either making it up or that it just somehow stops mattering. It's really showing this kind of lack of humanity to the overall system. And so we see that Evelyn has been put in danger. And so rather than essentially leaving her fate up to what person do you get on the day, that very, up in the air almost, crapshoot, we see that her family and Evelyn, they choose to simply hide Evelyn. They choose that she will go somewhere, she will find work where she lives under the, she can earn money under the table, where she will not be found, where she's separate from the family, where suddenly she no longer has safety. And that's how we see that she ends up with the Leroys. And we also see that that is part of why Evelyn was in such a very vulnerable state when Richard, bumps into her car. That even though in this situation Evelyn had done nothing, Evelyn is utterly dependent on the people who give her shelter. She's dependent on them not turning her into, essentially the embrace of the law, because that would have led to her immediate deportation because she had survived before. So and yet she still faces all these dangers. This leads us into a brief discussion of the Leroys and their horrific marriage. So we also learn more about Frank and Cheryl. We see that Cheryl is an extremely violent marriage. She is abused. We also understand, Frank, Evelyn has been warned, be really careful, don't say anything. We see that vulnerability. And the choice in Frank of who to avoid, he is choosing deliberately vulnerable people, because he can, in these ways, control and manipulate, just as he controls his wife. So we see, Frank essentially is someone who has taken full advantage of these people who are vulnerable to the system as something that will help him. So we also continue to see Evelyn's relationship with Cheryl, that it becomes described as a daughterly relationship, that This also relationship is something she recognizes from her own childhood in Guatemala as women who had no safety from the law, that the law was not going to protect them from violent husbands. And so we see that, Evelyn in that way recognizes it, and we see that she gets almost that daughterly relationship to Cheryl. It becomes something she recognizes the violence of it, even though she had a good relationship, obviously with her grandmother. And so we see that element. We see Cheryl then relying on Evelyn, loving Evelyn in return. In an interesting way, it's an easier relationship for Evelyn than her own relationship with the mother she found. And we also see Evelyn's complete devotion and love for Frankie, the child she is taking care of, and how Evelyn fits into this particular household. We also see her skills, her gifts, her decisions to, she thinks that Frankie can do this. It opens up a whole new world for him. She teaches him Spanish. They have a communication and a relationship that is something lovely. And, so we see essentially the things Evelyn gives to those around her. And we balance that against, interesting again, that on the, truly legal side, Evelyn is a lawbreaker. She ran when she was supposed to turn herself in. She, and she is choosing in a large way survival over what does the law demand. So we see that interesting element. All right. And then shifting forward, the last person we'll discuss is Richard. Obviously, Richard, we've had a profound number of revelations. We finally see what he is referring to as the sin, his hell, that thing he has been punishing himself for, in the entirety of what we see of his present existence. We now see, everything that happened. We see the marriage to Anita, essentially, and after they had Bibi, starting to unravel over the multiple miscarriages, Anita's, grief over that, her depression, the birth of Pablo, which was supposed to kind of help that, bring them out of that, followed by Pablo's death, as, at a year old, essentially, a month old, as Sid's baby. And, Richard's modern part in that was he picks the baby out of the crib, he carries it to the mother, he does not realize that he's holding a dead child. At that point, we see that this is a mutual tragedy. What follows then is we see what Richard has been punishing himself. Anita's complete descent into despair, her coming apart, Richard's own inability to deal with his own grief, with what is going on at home. He just essentially loses himself in liquor and going out at night, anything to avoid what is waiting for him and what he himself is emotionally incapable of dealing with, both the truth of the death of his own child, as well as just the enormity of Anita's despair. And then we see him returning home that morning and running over Bibi, the 4-year-old, in something that is completely, obviously, he would never have done that. Had he, it was not premeditated, it was not deliberate, it is an accident, and it is the accident that, starts to just completely, you see that this is one of the sins on Richard. He has killed his child. We see at 255 that, as essentially his wife's family is just kind of descending on her, trying to hold her together in her incredible grief. She has to be committed. She is force-fed. But we see that for Richard, 255, really important down here, although no one accused him of it to his face, he was treated like a murderer. And that was exactly how he felt. That to him, even though the law says this was unintentional, this is a tragic accident, this is not a crime, to Richard, he is a murderer. He has committed a crime. And then we see they both utterly fall apart. Anita, is incapable of caring for herself. Richard falls into complete depths of alcoholism. And then we have that, moment that he is referred to several times, that, that Horatio, that friend of his savior. And here we see that Horatio did in a large way save Richard, that he came down, He offered Richard a way out, a way back to the United States, a job, a path forward away from the grief that Richard was trapped in. Now, what saves Richard is not what would have been good for Anita. We see very clearly that really Anita's family was closing in, taking care of her, trying to help her forward out of whether or not she would have. Richard takes Anita back with him to the United States, saying, oh, her family can't spoil her now. We see that in that moment, Richard was focused on survival, really his own survival, not thinking about would this be Anita's survival. We see Horatio, even the friend, saying, is this right? And Richard saying, well, she's going to have to do it. We see the tragic consequences of that decision, that it is Richard's survival, it is his wife's destruction, that Anita, now in a strange place, no contact to her family, no support systems whatsoever, Anita chooses death. Anita commits suicide, and we see that Richard carries that in himself, that he considers himself the murderer of both Anita and Phoebe, that when he finally realizes that he made the decisions ultimately following, that his decisions in a very large and real way all pointed to Anita's death. Again, he is not guilty in the eyes of the law. He is guilty in his conscience. He is guilty in this idea, and we'll talk about this much more going forward, this idea of natural justice that we touch on toward the end of the book, but really forms a backbone throughout, that what he is punishing himself for is that sin for which the law will not punish him, that he feels responsible. You could make some very decent arguments. He is responsible, even though it is not illegal, even though it does not, mean that he is a morally unjust person or a bad person, but we see that his responsibility to this, and we also see how he then punishes himself for all those years, that this is, you can almost think that it's his atonement, he creates a hell for himself. He creates a situation where he punishes himself for those prior sins, for the deaths of Bibi and Nina. So that explains a great deal for us about Richard. It also, coming back up to the present, that Richard has gone through those years of atonement, of punishing. So when in that scene, we've really been building it for a long time, Richard and Lucia end up in bed together. They are, kind of have, realizing with a mutual way that they are in love. And he calls their love, in a lovely way, he says, it is a miracle. Because that is how he feels, that he could not possibly have deserved that. And yet, it is that gift. We see how both their paths bring them to the point where they kind of can have that relationship together. In other interesting elements in the present, we also have that decision time that essentially happens when they are, accessing Catherine's body. They are trying to set it up to sink the body and the car in the, pond where it will never be found. And looking at it, again, we see that Lucia has quite a lot of interesting knowledge, from all those years of trying to research, find out what happened to the disappeared and her brother. Honey, just wait just a minute. I will put the ball toy away. Thank you very much, sweetheart. So we see this interesting element where, thank you, where they have the murder weapon, they have Catherine's body, and the decision is made that they will not get rid of the evidence. They will not get rid of Catherine. They will put her in a place where she will be found, where the murder weapon will be found. And you can see that they are all at this point working from this assumption that obviously Frankie killed her. That Evelyn comes out and says, oh, well, yes, they were having an affair. Oh, I don't like to gossip. She was pregnant. So all three come to a decision, and you can see how all three, have kind of come along their own path. There's Evelyn and her knowledge of the deaths of her brother and her grief over Catherine, that Catherine would not have the things that had, to Evelyn in a very real way, soothed the souls of her brother. She would not have masses. She would not have a consecrated burial. She would not have those things that to Evelyn had been so critical for her brothers. To Lucia, we see that real worry about Catherine never being found, and it touches on her own experiences with her brother Enrique, and we also see Richard and his knowledge of how others have come. So we see that they make this decision. They kind of create a little bit of a comforting burial area for Catherine. They set it up and they put it in a place where she will be found in the springtime. And then they leave and go home. And that's in a large way the end of the major interludes of this story. That they send Richard and Lucia kind of become almost parental figures for Evelyn. They send Evelyn down to Florida to stay with Daniela. Richard and Lucia move in together. They have romance, they have love. And then finally at the end, we have this element of the truth of Catherine's death. And we have it when Lucia finally calls up Cheryl, the employer. And this is, essentially in a large way, the backbone of the story. It touches on the major themes we'll be talking about in our essay. And it's, one of those, really interesting things about an Allende book. It is lovely. So we, when Cheryl comes over, Cheryl assumes that Lucia already knows who killed Catherine, that it was actually Cheryl. It all comes out, what has happened, and Cheryl realizes that she has just confessed to murder to someone else when she thought she had kind of gotten away with it because Frankie has been, Frank, the husband, has been prosecuted for that murder, and it ultimately ended in Frank's, ultimately, ending up receiving justice, just justice for something he actually hadn't committed. So Cheryl was the one who actually killed Catherine. But we have that, when Cheryl says, so what's going to happen to me now? Asked Cheryl, horrified at what she had confessed 335. Nothing, Cheryl. The Lexus is at the bottom of the lake, and no one suspects the truth. They've gotten rid of the car. What we've said stays between the two of us. I'll tell Richard because he deserves to know, but there's no need for anyone else to find out. Frank Leroy has already done you and many others no harm. And then we will also see on 339, when she talks with Richard, obviously Richard a little less, blasé about a lot of these things. So he's saying, so Richard is saying, we'll have to tell everyone the truth about what happened to Catherine, Richard told Lucia. I'm on 339. Why complicate things? It's enough that you and I know. And besides, it's not important anymore. And Richard said, what do you mean it's not important? Cheryl Leroy killed that woman. And, here's Lucia. I hope you're not thinking she should pay for her crime, Richard. It was an accident. And, they're talking a little bit more. They're in love. And then we have what Lucia says, which is really important to everything about the book. The law is cruel and justice is blind. If there's one section in this book to really mark, it's this one on 339. The law is cruel and justice is blind. We tilted the balance slightly in favor of natural justice because we were protecting Evelyn, and now we have to do the same for Cheryl. Frank Leroy was a criminal, and he paid for his sins. And then we have it. Yeah, Richard. How ironic they couldn't catch him for the crimes he committed, and he had to escape for a crime he didn't commit, said Richard. And Lucia says, you see, that's what I mean by natural justice. And then, of course, they love. They're in love. So if we look at the overall and, those big takeaways on this book, think about what we've just said about this concept of natural justice. That this idea that the law is cruel and justice is blind, we tilted the balance slightly in favor of natural justice. If we look at this concept of natural justice, we can apply it to many of the characters that we see. For example, Frank. Frank is a man who committed many crimes. He was very much planning to kill his wife at some point, and probably also his disabled son in favor of his pregnant girlfriend. He had committed other crimes. He had, trafficked, in vulnerable people. He was taking advantage of vulnerable people in his day-to-day life, none of which the law was going to be able to punish him for. And yet he does ultimately face punishment due to other circumstances. This idea that, is this a man who deserved what he got? Well, I think we can all agree yes. But was he actually guilty of what they came after him for? He actually was not. And so it's that interesting balance of if you're going to have a strict legal interpretation, you'd say, like, well, no, he is not guilty of Catherine's death, therefore this is injustice. But if we look at it through the more of the natural justice lens, we say that, no, he was guilty and he was deserving of punishment. He should not have been at liberty to hurt other people. He has been stopped, therefore ends justify means. We can also apply the idea of natural justice very much to Richard, where Richard and the death of Bibi and Anita, neither things that the law would punish him for. The law does not consider him guilty in the death of Bibi, tragic accident, or the death of Anita, suicide, personal choice. And yet Richard feels himself a murderer. Richard spends, many, many years punishing himself, isolating himself, making a rigid existence in order to punish himself for what crimes he feels he has committed in those. And so we see that again, this is, by strict legal definition, no, Richard, not a murderer. By this idea of natural justice, Richard did commit, crimes. Richard was the cause of deaths. Richard should go through some sort of punishment atonement. And we see that in his, love of Lucia. He finally comes to it, coming to and finally forgiving himself, but that forgiveness comes through those years of atonement and that he has done that, essential, that atonement for the crimes he committed. Evelyn is an interesting, straightforward approach to law and natural justice. By the law, Evelyn should have been sent back to Guatemala. She commits a crime by crossing illegally. She commits another crime by then fleeing. And yet we know that to send her back would have likely been her death. And so by natural justice, Evelyn, who has committed, no harm against others, and in fact, works very hard to help others. We see her relationships with Cheryl, with Frankie, with her caring of children. That in a natural justice sense, for Evelyn to go, follow the strict, rule of law, be sent back to Guatemala, and certainly be murdered, that is a miscarriage of natural justice. And yet, we see these interesting contradictions between law and natural justice. And that is really that. I hope there are many things you bring out of this book, but what we'll be concentrating on for the essay in my lecture following this will be that very strong concept of law versus natural justice. And so, if you're having problems understanding that, rewind, listen to this, especially this last 10 minutes of the lecture again. But that is the concept we'll be focusing on for our essay. And also, it's one of the main takeaways of the book. Obviously, other main takeaways, we see how, the compassion of others saved lives. We see this interesting idea, certainly law versus natural justice. It is not simply a static thing in the Allende book. We see that Richard is aware that he owes his entire life to the kindness of others in defiance of the law, certainly to shield a Jewish man in the middle of the 1940s Europe was to go against the law, was to put your own life at risk. And yet Richard owes his very existence to those who broke the law, who chose compassion over a definition of the law. So those are the large takeaways from the latter part. I hope everyone enjoyed the conclusion of the Allende novel. And questions about either what I brought up or questions specifically about anything in the book that you're not certain of, please do put those on the discussion board, and I can answer questions, as they come up if you have something that you have very concerned. Those of you who enjoyed the Allende book, Isabel Allende is the author of many other very fine books. If you enjoyed that and you have some time on your hands for whatever reason and are currently closed lifestyles, I very much encourage you guys to check out many of her other books. Um, she is, I believe, offhand, you know, yes, The House of Spirits is in a large way her best known book. It was one of her first hits and one of her largest ones back in the days of Rita Winfrey's book club. But it is a very nice starting place if you are interested in reading more by Isabel Allende. And I hope everyone enjoyed this book. And make sure that you listen to my next lecture where I introduce the essay.